Hello, my name is David Sachs. I'm president of the Ottawa chapter of the Oxford University Society. We call ourselves affectionately OUS Ottawa for short. It's my pleasure to welcome you here today to our webinar on a topic of great interest, relevant to Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Thank you sincerely for joining us, whether from Ottawa, Toronto, Mexico City, Washington, D.C., or the UK or elsewhere. As you know, our specific topic is Russian online disinformation, acting as a kind of fifth column in Russia's invasion of Ukraine. And our guest speaker, to be introduced in a moment, is an expert on online disinformation and what can be done to counteract it. So, without further ado, I'd like now to call on Satya Nandlal of our OUS Ottawa Executive Committee to introduce to us our guest speaker.
Hello, everyone. Can folks hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Hi, everyone. As David said, my name is Satya Nandlal. I'm also with OUS Ottawa. And it's my pleasure to introduce our speaker today, Philippe-André Rodriguez. Mr. Rodriguez is an expert on disinformation, and he's going to be speaking to us on Russia's online disinformation campaign over Ukraine and how Canada is countering it. So evidently, given the horrors that are currently occurring in the Ukraine, this is a highly relevant topic, and we're very glad to have Mr. Rodriguez with us today. So Mr. Rodriguez holds a DPhil in Law and History from Oxford, where he was a Rhodes Scholar at Exeter College. And today at Global Affairs Canada, he is the Deputy Director for the Centre of International Digital Policy. He works at the intersection of digital technology and Canadian foreign policy. For folks who may not be aware, Global Affairs Canada is the government department in Canada that deals with foreign affairs, international trade, and international development. In 2018, Mr. Rodriguez played a lead role in creating the G7 Rapid Response Mechanism, which is one of the G7's main means to counter disinformation online. And among other responsibilities, he heads the Canadian delegation at UNESCO and at the Council of Europe that deals with the global governance of digital technologies. Mr. Rodriguez's research has been published in the Cambridge Review of International Affairs, the European Review of History, Human Rights Review, and other journals. He's also served as a senior advisor at Canada's Privy Council Office on issues regarding governance of digital technology, artificial intelligence, and online platforms. In between his Oxford days and joining the Canadian government, he was also a fellow at the Yale Law School. And today, in his spare time, so to speak, Mr. Rodriguez is a professor of practice at McMaster University. So very glad to have Mr. Rodriguez with us today, and without further ado, on behalf of OUS Ottawa, it's my honor to introduce Philippe-André Rodriguez. Over to you, Philippe-André.
Thank you so much, Sasha, and thank you so much, David, and the whole community of OUS Ottawa for the invitation. I must say, as a civil servant, I have lost the custom of being introduced so formally for speaking opportunities. It's really great to be here today and really to talk, as David, you mentioned, about such a timely topic and one that has really occupied us for quite a bit of time now, which is disinformation, state-sponsored disinformation, and in particular, Russian strategies related to disinformation. I will try to keep my opening remarks relatively short because I'd like to get into a conversation, which I think is where there is more interest for the entirety of this community. And so I will start very quickly by introducing just what is disinformation. I think it's a topic, it's a term that we hear often in the media, in scholarly papers, but it's still a relatively underdefined phenomenon, and one where if we don't really take the time to think through what we are going to discuss, the conversation may go sideways very rapidly. And so Broadly speaking, and we should clarify today, obviously, we are talking about a specific kind of disinformation, which is state-sponsored disinformation. That is really disinformation campaigns that are either directly and proactively driven by governments, or instances where specific organizations or institutions are being amplified by certain government actors who really to achieve their own kind of foreign policy and domestic objectives. And when we're talking about disinformation, really a very basic definition that we could use for this conversation, and that we often use in government, is really when a specific actor, again, can be different actors, manipulates the organic flow of information so as to artificially shape its audience's perception of it. And traditionally, obviously, disinformation is not necessarily something that flows from the reality of digital technologies and its emergence in the last 10, 15 years. But obviously, its prevalence and its concern, especially in liberal democracies, is relatively tightly attached to that emergence of digital technology. So obviously, this flow of information being significantly impacted, influenced by the rise of platforms, of communications online and in digital contexts. And obviously, this is going to be part of the conversation today. More specifically, though, one thing to note when we're talking about state-sponsored disinformation is that every state actor really takes a different approach to it based on their objectives, their expertise, their background, their culture. And so when we are thinking about the kind of countering measures related to disinformation campaigns, we really have to take into consideration and keep in mind that every state actor acts very differently when it comes to disinformation. Russia in particular is potentially the most salient example. It's fairly publicly documented that Russia is a central player in the disinformation operation sphere, and it has its traditional kind of own objectives, which to really summarize very quickly, we could say that really Russia's objective is to undermine the quote unquote Western Bloc by undermining really the very idea of liberal democracy as a government model. And it does that in multiple of ways, some of which are evidenced during this Ukraine situation, the attack really on Ukraine, others which have really surfaced in other moments, whether it is amplifying specific tropes in society, right? Like very often Russia will not necessarily create artificially new movements, but will really play off of existing inequalities and existing sensitivities in cultural context, and will really, as I said, artificially drive some of these in one way or another, so that there is a sense that certain issues, which are not necessarily really societal issues, become so in the way they are amplified artificially. And there's multiple examples of that, whether it is some of the amplification around, for instance, a good example that I like to use, and which is not Canadian or American or British, and so is kind of a little bit more external, is the example of the Catalonian situation. Catalonia being obviously one region in Spain with a fairly high level of sovereignists. And if you will remember, a few years ago, there was a movement towards a referendum in that situation. And while Russia didn't really mind what the result of that referendum would be, played a large part in terms of amplifying both the pro and the against movement for independence of Catalonia from Spain, so as to create polarization, division within the Spanish society, within Spain, and also to really amplify some of the EU links of that Catalonian crisis so as to really amplify divisions, concerns within the European Union, which obviously from a Russian perspective aims at their objective of, as I said, undermining Western democracies within the EU. And so that's really something that we're seeing in general with Russia, this objective. That plays out in the West, as I said, that plays out also in the global South, where disinformation campaigns are really aimed at undermining the authority, the legitimacy of liberal democracy as a model, really in favor of a different type of model, usually an authoritarian approach to governance, and one that is driven by digital technologies, what is often referred to as digital authoritarianism, although that might be a little bit strong of a term, but that's generally what we're talking about in terms of the kind of approach to disinformation we're seeing in the global South. And maybe I'll finish with just a few words in terms of what we're seeing in the Ukrainian situation more specifically before we can turn to a conversation. One thing I've noticed in some of the Canadian media is this idea that the disinformation campaigns have failed in the West because Russia has not been able to really undermine the pushback against its illegal invasion of the Ukraine. But I think we need to be a little bit mindful here that it would have been difficult for an actor like Russia to really convince an audience that what it does is really legitimate. And so the general sense that we have, those of us who are kind of looking at these things, is that this was never really the objective of the disinformation campaign, or at least not a central objective. But that actually, when we're looking at the content, when we're looking at what's happening online, what we're seeing is that a lot of it was actually, a lot of the strategy, the Russian strategy, was really about, first of all, kind of saying, look, this is a Russian-Ukraine issue. We should not engage. We should disengage from what's happening there. This is a local issue. Let's focus on our own problems internally. Let's focus on what's happening in Canada or the US or France or Britain. And so that's really been one of the main strategies that we've seen in terms of diminishing the meaning, support for the pushback really against Russia. Another thing that we've seen in the global South in particular, and it's an issue that we often don't necessarily talk about in Canada or in a lot of Western contexts, is really that a lot of the disinformation we're seeing is really targeting countries outside of the EU, outside of North America, and really trying to keep a momentum of support for Russia internationally. And we can get to why that is afterwards, but at least that's been a really big part of what we're seeing in terms of a disinformation campaign, really focusing on things like, why is the West engaging in Ukraine when it's not engaging in other conflicts worldwide? So a lot of whataboutism in terms of the approach that the West and Canada and allies are taking in the Ukraine. And another one, which is really around framing this approach as fundamentally imperial, colonial, that it's old Western imperial tropes showing their head, and that the rest of the world should disengage from that momentum and from those kinds of engagement that we're seeing from Canada, from the US, from the UK, and others. So just to put it on the table, that when we're talking about disinformation, we're not only talking about what's affecting Canada, but that it really is beyond the global North or the West, and it's really a global phenomenon which has repercussions for Canada and others in terms of legitimacy for democracy, rule of law, and human rights, as really a mechanism, a model of societal organization that I think we all hold dear in Canada. So I'll stop it there. There's a lot we could discuss, but I'm really looking forward to the discussion.
Thank you very much, Philippe-André. It was a lovely introduction to the complex subject. Hello, everyone. My name is Akash Maharaj. I will be moderating the questions to Philippe-André. If you have questions, please feel free to type them under the Q&A tab. I have to apologize. We've had more attendees than we expected, and we appear to have broken Zoom. So if you are not showing up with the ability to post questions in the Q&A and wish to do so, I've placed in the chat an email address. My own email address is akash, A-K-A-A-S-H, @maharaj, maharaj.org. I have my email client open. You can email them to me if you don't have access to the Q&A, and I will put them to Philippe-André. I'd also like to begin by welcoming and specifically mentioning our colleagues from the Oxford University Society chapters in Washington, D.C. and in Mexico City. From Washington, we have Sean Dennison and Katie Prolan. Thank you for joining us. Our three chapters have a tradition of joint events, and we're delighted to see both them and their members with us. Philippe-André, I'll start off with a question about you remarked that Canadians may be beguiled into thinking that the Russian disinformation campaign has failed because they have been concentrating on the global south rather than on us. That, of course, raises the questions. What is the objective of the Russians in their disinformation with the global south? And how is that different from the objectives they might have with Canadians and countries like Canada?
Thank you. That's a great question. And just to clarify, I don't think that there's been no attention to the global north. There definitely has been, but it's really gathered more media attention compared to the global south disinformation campaigns. And yes, I think that the actual objectives are very, very different. When we're talking about the dynamic, especially in North America, to limit ourselves to that in terms of global north, generally speaking, there is a sense that disinformation campaigns very rarely target Canada directly, partly because our information ecosystem in North America is so integrated that whatever targets the US will inevitably target Canada, at least indirectly, at least outside of, let's say, Francophone circles mostly in Quebec and Francophone communities across Canada. And so in terms of the kind of energy spent on campaigns, there seems to be less of a need for Russia or other actors to focus directly on Canada, but rather to focus on the situation in the US to have a broader impact for a lower cost, which really for us also means as Canadians that we need to pay attention to what's happening outside Canada to better understand the way in which the information ecosystem within Canada operates. And also there's been a good study done by McGill University and the team led by Taylor Owen and others around the trust that Canadians have for traditional media, the CBC, Radio-Canada, and others, that really creates a little bit more of a protection against disinformation compared to other Western contexts where that trust might not be the same. So just to kind of clarify on that. In terms of the global south, I think there is a sense that that Russia has a lot more to lose in terms of its support from the global south towards its activities in the Ukraine, its attack, given that it's becoming increasingly difficult to continue supporting Russia in the face of its activity and the exposure and the level of exposure of its activities and its atrocities, really. And we even heard, as you know, the Prime Minister speak about a genocide in the Ukraine. So I think it's becoming increasingly difficult, morally in particular, for governments across the global south to support Russia. And we kind of feel like that might be a reason why there is such an exposure or an attempt to shape the discourse there. In terms of what exactly this looks like, I mean, as I said, there's really a focus on trying to have a whataboutism approach to say, you know, why is the West really focusing on this situation when they're not focusing, or you know, there's a perception that they're not focusing on other conflicts internationally, which is not necessarily true, but that's really what the narrative looks like. And the reality is also that to a large extent, Russia, yes, is dependent on money coming from the EU, for instance, but it's also very much dependent on its economic ties to the global south, and to an image of liberator of oppressed regimes throughout its Soviet history, really. And so, again, our sense is really that there's a little bit of a sense that there's more to lose by losing that support in the global south versus global north, which was kind of bound and inevitably would push back against what is happening in the Ukraine.
That's interesting. Following on from that, we have a question from Paul Good, and he asks, who are the main targets? So I will summarize it. I hope you don't mind, Paul, to link it to the previous remarks. Even if the targets of Russian disinformation are primarily in the global south, or preferentially in the global south, I should say, when they do target Canadians, who are their targets? Do they selectively target Canadians of Russian or Ukrainian descent? Do they select far-right voters? Insofar as they are targeting Canadians, whom within our society are they targeting?
Yeah, and I mean, one of the things that's very difficult about Russian disinformation, and I mentioned that there's a lot of different state actors, and Russia is likely the most sophisticated actor in terms of disinformation campaigns. So, just preface this by saying it's very difficult to know exactly when a campaign is or can be attributed to Russia versus other actors. And as we mentioned, I've been working on this issue more or less since 2018, 2017. And at the time, the campaigns were really, really easy to trace back to a state actor, whether it be Russia or another. Now it's increasingly difficult to do so. So to make a final statement on whether Russia is playing off of, Ukrainian diaspora communities or other types of communities, as I said, is very difficult to identify. That being said, I think what we've seen, and as I said earlier, is that Russia seems to go back to groups that already have or are predisposed to agree with some of its positions, or at least with the idea that Canada should disengage from whatever is happening over there. And so, for instance, that could be communities that already discuss or have a high level of distrust for the Canadian government, for instance, whether it is, links with anti-vax communities, for instance, who are relatively well organized online. And so targeting these kinds of communities and making these links between what the government or the perceived lies of the government related to COVID-19 and saying, well, maybe they're just lying all the same when it comes to Ukraine, for instance. So really playing off of those kind of already baked in communities that have this level of mistrust or that are going to be more receptive to their audience. And so we've seen that quite a bit. In terms of diaspora communities, there's obviously an element there. Again, I think there it's a little bit more difficult to attribute, I think. We kind of all assume that is actually the case, that there is that kind of engagement trying to really blur the information about what's happening on the ground, really creating some kind of informational fog of war. But again, it's very difficult to attribute those traits to Russia or state affiliated organizations.
Thank you. We have a question from Valentina. Valentina Dirkat, a question via email, and she's writing to us or watching from Lviv. It's a very concise question, but a very deep one. How many Canadians are buying what the Russians are selling?
That's the $1 billion question by now, right? It's an exceedingly difficult question to answer. And even when you ask academics who are doing empirical study on trying to understand just how much impact do disinformation campaigns have, they run into the same kind of issues that people trying to measure marketing campaigns have. It's extremely difficult to measure. And obviously, what does buying means in this context, right? Like, to what extent is it just a slight change of opinion, or maybe an opening that maybe the authority of the government, of the source that's telling me the information is lying, or is self-interested in a way that they may not tell me all that's true, versus a full result of full support for Russia. There's really a spectrum there in terms of the kind of receptivity that we're seeing to this kind of information that's extremely difficult to measure on a case-by-case basis. However, given that we now have a little bit more of a history of disinformation online since 2016, 2017 in particular, if not before that, but really an amplification and an increase in disinformation campaigns since then, we know that it has an impact on voting patterns, for instance, around elections, on voter turnout for elections, on support for specific initiatives, positively and negatively, because disinformation campaigns sometimes are also about, as I said, creating support for specific movements. There's a lot of studies in the US about how Russia has really meddled in movements like the Black Lives Matter movement, really to amplify the BLM movement in the US, so as to create more polarization within the US, so really playing off of these kind of existing divisions. Obviously, this is not my area of expertise, and I would defer to the experts in terms of the level of success there. But there is a lot of research in terms of the kinds of success that we've seen. But it's give a definitive answer here is very, very difficult, because we're really talking about internal perceptions, mental perceptions towards something, and it's really difficult to measure. Just like I said, the fact that marketing is very difficult to measure, or advertisement, or anything like that.
Thank you. So that raises or touches on a question from Katie Krolop in Washington, D.C. Given that to be effective, disinformation, as you've described it, tries to tap into local concerns and local grievances, it has to be very focused on local concerns. Katie's question is, would it be effective and or efficient for democracies to coordinate their domestic anti-disinformation efforts? So that's an interesting question. The disinformation, to the extent that it's being controlled by a single mind, one for global objectives, one would think that a global approach would be effective. But on the other hand, what you've described is a campaign that is highly tailored, highly focused, and very different in different national contexts.
Yeah, and we're getting into the what to do about it kind of territory. I think that's absolutely true. There always needs to be a local response because campaigns are very much local. There is, however, a big role to play in terms of international coordination and collaboration. One of the things we mentioned, the rapid response mechanism, one of the things that I think it does very well is allow teams who are working on this information to learn from one another in terms of what they are seeing locally. Because obviously the way in which these actors very often work is as copycats. Whatever works in one context may work in the next context. What a failure in one context, we're going to fix it for the next. An easy example of that is some of the work that Russia did, its campaign around the last presidential election in France, where it really played on what ended up becoming the Macron leaks, which was not actually a disinformation campaign. It was a different type of information operation, really leaking a lot of documents that really undermined President Macron, which kind of everybody assumes it to be in favor of his opponent in the second round of the presidential election at the time, was the same as this time around, and Marine Le Pen, not to name her. And one of the things that our French colleagues noticed there is that strategy did not work well because it was all in English, and Russians didn't necessarily, or whatever actor that were behind it, including very, very likely Russia, didn't necessarily take into consideration the fact that if you don't actually create organically or language in the local language, namely French in this case, the engagement will be a lot less prevalent when it comes to the campaign. And so what we've seen really is then Russia and actors adapting to that reality and that lesson. So I mentioned the Catalonia case, for instance, where researchers in Spain have really showed how Russia has worked with Venezuela in terms of creating a joint disinformation campaign in Spanish in that context. And so we're also seeing that collaboration and that coordination from these kinds of actors. There's a really good series, it's in Spanish, unfortunately, but there's a really good series of articles in El País, in a newspaper from Madrid, that really emphasizes on that campaign in particular, which was really insightful. And so this kind of exchange, which we're seeing, is really important in terms of understanding the tactics, so that locally we can then adjust the response, understand where to look online, what kinds of groups to look into to better understand what's happening.
Thank you. I'm going to combine two questions, one from David Sachs in Ottawa and one from Stephen Douglas in the United Kingdom. What are the mechanisms that Russia uses to insert disinformation into Western online dialogues? So in addition to directly injecting their message, are there other witting or unwitting agents? What is the chain of handoff like typically? And Stephen Douglas gives an example of people who masquerade as supporters of Ukraine, even posing with Ukrainian flags in their biographies to allow themselves entry into conversations, but then in that conversation start taking the opposite position. So do you have thoughts for us about the kinds of patterns of the injection of disinformation that the participants in this webinar could use or could be aware of to have their antennae up?
Yeah, that's a great question. Well, I would say first that the Ukraine situation is peculiar in that Russia kind of exposed itself, right? It's a central player in ways that that is not necessarily the case in other moments when Russia is trying to undermine democracy or other actors are trying to undermine democracy or democratic institutions, right? So it's a different kind of level of exposure, which creates different types of engagement. So just in terms of, are we talking about kind of traditional Russian tactics versus what we're seeing specifically in Ukraine? I think it's a little bit different. And as I said, I think, strategies evolve. And so let's see where that goes going forward. That being said, in terms of what to see, what to look, as I said, it's very difficult because most of the time for instance, we mentioned the group chats where someone may be brought in and then kind of starts to question. Those questionings or that behavior is not necessarily going to be anti-Ukraine. Again, it's not necessarily going to be, pro-Russia, really. It might be just that they will question the decision made by the government in ways that are, totally permissible under human rights law, freedom of expression, charter rights, but with specific objectives of undermining the support that Canada brings to a case like this one, right? So, and so that's why it's so tricky and so difficult to really gauge and react to these situations. I think one of the things to do in terms of public-facing disinformation is really always to question the source. To question who is making these comments, what kind of pattern of speech that actor has had in the last little while. Usually you will see a change, for instance, when an actor kind of speaks a lot on Syria or in another situation, and then all of a sudden they're all about Ukraine. That should ring the antenna that there's a good chance they're not necessarily organically participating in the conversation or in a dialogue. There's also the timing of inclusion of some of these actors in those conversations. Obviously with Ukraine, again, it's a little bit more difficult because it's a crisis moment, but generally in other contexts, you see people popping in really before key moments, like a debate, a public debate around an election, or a few days before the actual election, or when there's a specific scandal that comes out, trying to amplify that, right? So the timing is also usually a good indication. And again, and same thing in terms of its pickup, and to go to the broader question of the ways in which disinformation is inserted. Again, usually it's not necessarily the kind of pro-Russia trope we're seeing. It's going to be more about something that might attract journalists to get attention to a specific issue. So they might artificially create some momentum around a specific topic, so that journalists pay attention. And when journalists pay attention, there's a good chance politicians pay attention. There's a good chance the public pays attention. And then you've just created a chain of reaction of attention to an issue that might not otherwise have been picked up, because it organically wouldn't have had that kind of level of attention, but that with that kind of artificial amplification, the oxygen of amplification, as some researchers have put it, create that kind of momentum towards potential polarization, mistrust towards certain actors, for instance. So it's again very difficult and increasingly difficult for researchers in government, but also, I mean, you can talk to a number of academics and think tanks who are doing this work who would tell you the same thing. It's increasingly difficult to pick up these patterns, which is why collaboration and really a strong community of experts is so important.
Thank you. We have a question by email from Sergei Primakov in Moscow, who identifies himself as a member of the Yabloko party. Sergei, I hope you won't mind if I summarize this, because it's a long message. I think the key part is when Russian state actors intervene in communications, it's called propaganda. When Canadian state actors intervene, it's called public information and education. What is the difference?
Well, first of all, propaganda is not necessarily illegal under international law, right? So there's a really distinction to make between propaganda and disinformation in my mind, and in the mind, I think, of most researchers. Propaganda is usually done in the open, and its objectives are generally fairly straightforward. Raising the profile of a certain situation, right? Like even in the case of Ukraine, building or the fact that the Russian embassies on Twitter really retweet pro-Russian support for the attack, for the war. To me, that's fundamentally different than a campaign that really tries to artificially amplify the idea that people are supporting a specific view. And so when we're talking about public information, traditionally, at least, propaganda is considered to be that kind of public information. And so to respond to that question, I think maybe the issue here is with the word propaganda itself, but in terms of actual phenomena, Canada, for instance, does not partake in these kinds of covert, malicious kinds of activities, trying to shape the dialogue, the narrative online in ways that would deceive the audience in ways that some of these other actors do. So I think that the regardless of the words we use, I think in terms of the actual phenomena that we're studying, there's a fundamental difference in terms of the kind of information operation we're discussing.
Thank you. I apologize for everyone whose name I'm going to massacre. I hope you will take some comfort knowing that, given that I have a name like Akash Maharaj, I get as good as I give. We have a question from Maja Sevadslami from Finland, and she asks via email, and she asks in summary, she believes that Finland has been, to a certain extent, insulated from propaganda because no one outside Finland speaks Finnish. Has Canada been insulated from Russian propaganda because of the French fact in Canada?
I think Finland is one of the leading countries in terms of what to do when it comes to disinformation, and a country that I think Canada and others are looking at. It's true that part of this protection is coming from this local language barrier, but Finland has been so good at including civic literacy and digital literacy in its school curriculum in ways that really inoculate the Finns from the kind of these kinds of information operations, disinformation, information manipulation, which, in terms of what Canada is doing, we're really looking at these kinds of model for examples in terms of how we organize ourselves to counter disinformation, instead of focusing on content legislation, for instance, which we have seen mostly fail in other contexts, internationally or amongst like-mindeds, really focusing on takedown regimes, focusing on digital literacy, and really raising civic literacy, humanities, critical thinking, are really key building blocks for any kind of response to these kinds of strategies that we're seeing. And I think Finland has been really good at doing it. Canada is getting there. We've had, for instance, a digital citizenship initiative that our colleagues from Canadian Heritage are leading, which is really all about that, really bringing citizenship to a digital age and giving citizens the tools to engage in those conversations with the proper level of education and understanding. And that's a big part of how we're responding, generally speaking, to disinformation and information disorders online, and one that I think we should highlight. And that in part takes its inspiration from the Finnish model.
Thank you. Alexandra Kabu from Vienna, again by email, asked, can we learn from the Russian example to depropagandize the Russian people? And I think she's asking, can we use the sorts of communications tools, or can we draw lessons from the communications strategies that the Russians have used against us and draw positive lessons from that about what works to communicate messages to people in Russia and perhaps elsewhere who are currently only hearing propagandized and disinformation messages?
The answer to that is potentially more at an infrastructural level, in the sense that one of the challenges with the flow of information at the international level is that increasingly countries are fragmenting the internet, in countries like Russia more than most, in ways that it's increasingly difficult for not necessarily Canada per se, but human rights defenders, proponents of democracy, of freedom of expression, of the rule of law, to engage with Russians. And I think this is definitely something that, those who have studied the Cold War will talk about, how the Helsinki moment when, human rights defenders were allowed into Russia as kind of a threshold moment, right? Like there's historical examples as to what works. And I think ideally this is what we would see in terms of a general trend, but actually what we're seeing is the exact opposite, where, as you probably know, Human Rights Watch is now barred from Russia. Amnesty International has been barred. A host of international media outlets have been kicked out of the country, and the internet is increasingly fragmented from the rest of the open-ended internet. And this is really something that we have to keep in mind when we're talking about disinformation internationally, and the high level of that kind of messaging that governments have towards their own population online. And this is actually why Canada, one of the reasons why Canada is chairing the Freedom Online Coalition this year, which is really an organization that is dedicated to human rights, to defending human rights in digital and online contexts. And one of its kind of fundamental mission is to fight against internet fragmentation, You might have seen that our minister, Minister Joly, as chair of the Freedom Online Coalition, released a statement a few weeks ago that I was fortunate to work on, really calling out disinformation campaigns in Russia and really reasserting the value of an open internet for any kind of information flow to continue to exist. And so that's another barrier that we have to face in terms of this kind of human rights, democracy, rule of law promotion internationally, that kind of closing of internet spaces in some of those countries.
Okay. Well, given the fact that Canada and other democracies have open, at least relatively open internet and online properties, I'll ask Tom Blackwell's question from the Q&A tab. Can you give an example of how Russia might target a Canadian group like anti-vaxxers on Ukraine? What is the mechanism? How is it actually done in a context such as Canada, where there is an open internet?
Facebook groups, Reddit groups. It's not that difficult. The barrier of entry and the price to do it is extremely low. We've mentioned before, it might just be one person who joins a Facebook group of people talking about in very legitimate kind of ways democratically about criticizing the government policy related to vaccination, right? Like this is part of also democracy, open societies, to be able to criticize the government's positions. And so you would see an actor, a group of actors, group of, Russia, for instance, hiring a troll farm, as we call them, a group of actors to go onto these groups and amplify a certain view of the government and to make those ties between, as I said, mistrust for the government when it comes to positions related to vaccination, and make the links to Ukraine, make the link to how we shouldn't care about Ukraine, or that Ukraine is a way to get the attention away from the vaccination situation, or whatever. Like there's different ways in which that kind of communication mechanisms can work, but the barrier of entry is exceedingly low. And it's hard also for governments, but also for platforms to really say, we're going to be the mediators, the arbiters of what we're allowing in terms of things that are otherwise very much allowed in terms of freedom of expression and human rights law. And so that kind of balance between ensuring that we continue to have open societies that uphold human rights really and democracy, whilst kind of really getting at that kind of artificial amplification is a very, very tricky business, and one that really we continually have to readjust. Not just we as the government of Canada, but I think we see the same from platforms and from actors who have to think about these kinds of questions.
Well, your example of Facebook raises a point that I will offer myself and then link to a question that I received via email. I'm conscious that in broader, this isn't broader, but in the context of combating hatred online, recently, a few months ago, Facebook culled a very large number of groups, the kind of groups that you're talking about, but which were being used to spread online hatred. And in a survey of some of the people participating in those groups afterwards, a full 60% of the participants in proscribed groups that were later proscribed by Facebook, said that they were drawn into those groups because the groups had been suggested to them by Facebook's own algorithms. And so that takes me on to a question from Liliana Tataru from Moldova. To what extent are social media platforms collaborating with Russian propaganda, not out of an ideological sympathy, but because it's good for business?
I like the international flavor of the audience here. It's great to see so many countries engaging. I don't think they have to engage directly, right? They don't have to, because the way in which platforms operate is really to favor the kinds of contents that will keep people on the platform, right? Like the way in which platforms work is, the more you are on a platform, the more data they can gather from you, and the more data they can gather from you, the more data they can sell to advertisers, right? Like that's the business model, like in 3 seconds of most platforms. And so algorithms online are really on these platforms are really shaped to keep you online. And so when they recommend, a group that might, keep you on the platform for a longer period of time, that's how it works. So there's no, there might be, I'm not in the secret of the gods, but I don't think there needs to be explicit tacit links between, specific regimes and online platforms, big tech companies, because the business model itself of these companies plays to the objectives of the Russias of the world. And to be quite frank, I think this is where we need to look in terms of government interventions. It's not necessarily at the content level. It's not necessarily at that level of takedown regimes, as we've seen, but really at understanding how algorithms work, so as to have more technical interventions at that level to diminish and really alleviate those kinds of risks of polarization, of leading certain individuals who may be predestined to join some of these groups for societal reasons, pre-existing reasons, to join these kinds of groups and become polarized extremists or hold these kinds of views. So I think that's one of the interventions that are being considered, obviously, again, by some of our colleagues domestically at Canadian Heritage. And I think that's probably the right one at this point. However, and I think from my experience, one of the challenges that we're seeing play out in countries that are trying to make these kinds of interventions, the UK, the EU, for instance, is that we're still not at a stage where we fully understand how these algorithms work. They're still, they are protected by intellectual property. It's very difficult for governments to really have a really good understanding of how they work. And so it's very difficult to intervene properly to fix some of those issues without that level of transparency, of openness to really understand how they work. So in terms of intervention or a first step, and again, here I'm talking as on my personal name, not necessarily as the representative of the government, but I think to me, the first intervention should really be to create a transparency regime so that we better understand how these algorithms work. And Akash, when we discussed before this call, you made a really good point that there's also a really good chance that the platforms themselves don't entirely know how their algorithms work, and that they still don't get really the implications of some of the machine learning algorithms that they're developing. And so that's also tricky. That's also a challenge that we'll have to face as we try to respond to this societal challenge, is really to work with platforms to find common solutions that continue to really respect human rights, respect freedom of expression, freedom of association, privacy, whilst really getting at an intervention that actually fixes the issue.
Thank you. I'll pluck out a question that touches on that point. And this comes by email. I apologize to the person. There are characters in your name that are non-Roman characters, so I don't know how to pronounce it. But the surname is Inga daughter. And her question is, I'll summarize it by saying her question is there adequate algorithmic transparency to the way in which these platforms operate to allow state regulators to get some sense of whether the algorithms themselves have been hijacked by state actors?
The answer is no. I think it's fairly straightforward that the answer is no. I think that realization, though, is getting us to a place where we understand that this needs to be something more than a realization and more of a norm at the global level, and potentially legitimize kind of regulatory interventions. There's been some good work in Canada by organizations like CG, for instance. I'm not exactly sure what CG stands for. We just call it CG. Someone will know. But they've, under Chris Beale, they've done some really interesting work in terms of trying to develop what a transparency mechanism could look like, and really trying to see whether, that's kind of the next step. How can we develop these kinds of mechanisms in a way that is interoperable between different jurisdictions? So really bringing different governments together to think about how do we make this kind of a little bit more concerted and coordinated. So there's some work in that direction. It's still relatively nascent, but this is really where we're heading in terms of norms and in terms of the kind of justifiable, legitimate approach to regulation. Because I think, and this needs to be said, one of the challenges with regulating big tech companies is that actually it really has legitimized some ways in which countries in different cultural contexts have used that excuse of disinformation to stifle free expression, to harass people online, to surveil in ways that are really, really opposed to really what we're trying to do when we're intervening. And so when we're thinking about the kind of regulatory regime we want, we have to think about that as well. And that's why this piece of international coordination around intervention is so crucial, is so key, so that we don't legitimize, we don't give leeway for some of those regimes to really bring initiatives that may really directly undermine free expression, democracy, rule of law, and really just worsen the situation.
Thank you. I will put the final question from the emails from Lex Naidu from South Africa. And I apologize to everyone else who sent in emails, questions via email. I'm sorry that we've only been able to get through a small fraction of them. I've tried to choose questions that represent global and thematic diversity, but perhaps I can package them up after this webinar and see if I can prevail upon Philippe-André for a bit more of his time to see if he'd be willing to perhaps respond to these questions in some ways so that we could post them on our website for those of you whose questions have not been asked. But the final question that we have, again, I will summarize it as, is it the business of governments to decide what is disinformation or not? Is it perhaps not the case that in a democracy, it should be up to the intellectual free market ideas of free citizens to decide what they believe is believable?
That's a great question. One of the challenges with that is that what is the alternative? Well, first of all, I think, and I've been very clear here, I really don't think we need governments to intervene in terms of shutting down content. I think that's not the way to go, at least not at this point, because I don't think we have a definition of disinformation that really is workable to really create a regime around it. So that's the first thing. The second thing is, so what's the alternative? If governments are not the arbiters of hate speech, for instance, then it's going to be left to corporate players to make that call. And there's a level to which governments at least are held accountable for their decisions, with democratically held elections in ways that corporate players aren't. And so there is that level, that question of accountability here that I think is key in terms of the level of engagement from governments in this question. That being said, I fully agree that it is definitely not the business of government to decide what is true and what isn't. And I certainly hope that none of what I said today gave that indication, and that actually this is not what we're talking about. What we're talking about here is specific state actors trying to completely disrupt the free flow of information, the marketplace of ideas in ways that really undermine the very basis of democracy, which is that free flow, free exchange of ideas, so that citizens can make informed decisions about policy and vote accordingly, engage civically accordingly. And without that, I think, and it's one of the reasons why democracies depend so much on this information flow.
Thank you so much, Philippe-André. With that, I will ask our colleague David and Keith if they would like to offer up some concluding remarks.
Akash, thank you. Am I on screen? No.
No, but we can hear you. Oh, there you are. You're on screen.
Look, that was a remarkable 60 minutes with much to praise, including the thoughtful and well-informed questions from the audience and the speaker's expertise and deftness in handling them. To officially thank our guest speaker, let me now call on Keith O'Rourke, who's a member of our OUS Ottawa Executive Committee. Keith?
Yes, I'd very much like to thank Philippe-André for taking his valuable time to engage in such an informative discussion. It actually has me worried about the same thing happening in science now, because in science, people have to come together to find out from each other how they're wrong, and this is going to try and block that. It's amazing that we've had questions from so many places in the world. This is recorded, and hopefully people will benefit from it after it's done. Thanks very much.
All right, well, sorry, Akash.
Nope. Go ahead, David. The floor is yours.
I'm sorry, shall I conclude or would you prefer to? Okay. In just a few words in closing, not to keep everyone much longer, but I did want to thank very much our guest speaker and to all of you who attended today. As has been said, a remarkable array, people tuning in from Moldova, Russia, Finland, South Africa. Quite impressive and humbling to my mind. I did want to comment very briefly on a personal note. One of the ideas of the many that I took away today was to be reminded of this idea of political polarization, a word that kept coming up. I live in Canada as an American citizen. I've watched the toxic domestic politics in the US, and lately I've watched Canada rushing to catch up with its own brand of political polarization. And it's very saddening to reflect that some percentage of this might be the effect of Russian disinformation campaigns. On a happier note, this has been the latest installment in the Three Capitals webinar series, which links up the Oxford alumni chapters of Ottawa, Mexico City, and Washington, D.C. Thanks especially to our colleagues in Washington and Mexico City, and to viewers around the world, all of you tuning in today. Also, I would like to acknowledge very briefly our local Ottawa affiliates, including Cambridge, Ottawa, Friends of the LSE, and other British University alumni groups here in Ottawa. Lastly, I can't let you go without thanking our webmaster and moderator, Akash Maharaj, Vice President of OUS Ottawa, for his remarkable skill and sang-froid. Anyway, on behalf of OUS Ottawa, I hope you've enjoyed today's program. Thank you and goodbye.